I'm Jill Anderson. This is the Harvard EdCast. Eric Soto-Shed knows how challenging it is to teach the election in classrooms, especially during politically charged times. But he also knows it's necessary. He's an experienced teacher whose work focuses on civics curriculum development and teacher training. As tensions rise in the current political landscape, many teachers face difficult decisions about how or if they should incorporate election topics into their classrooms. Soto-Shed said there's ways to talk about the election, even if you face community pressure or restrictive state policies. He stresses how important it is to teach the election for our democracy and to prepare future young voters. First, I asked him whether schools are actively teaching the election now.
It's a great question. It's also, I think, a very broad question, right? The curriculum spans many grades, many subjects. And so if you kind of look at it at its broadest level, I think, survey data is showing us that the majority of teachers are not planning on teaching the election. But you also need to ask the question, does a ninth grade trigonometry teacher have the same responsibility, capacity, or skill set to teach the election as, say, maybe an eighth grade civics teacher? So I think that we are seeing some reluctance from even our most skilled social studies teachers and civics teachers as well, because this is a particularly charged moment in our political environment. And there's also a lot of policies around what can and cannot be taught in schools. And so I would certainly say there are many teachers that are excited and skilled and really digging into the election. But I think there are more teachers than we like to see that are dissuaded or don't really see the possibility for them to engage their students around this election.
Right. We live in this contentious political climate right now. And I imagined educators would be afraid to discuss this or might be getting discouraged by administrators to go there in their classrooms. What would you say are some of the fears that teachers have when it comes to this topic in their classrooms?
I think when you think about the fears, kind of like what are the obstacles?
Right.
What are the things that are getting in the way of teaching? And so I think the first ones that I would name would be community or social pressures, right? And this can be particularly prevalent in places where a teacher's political beliefs don't match the community's, right? So this could be a conservative teacher in a liberal community, a liberal teacher and a conservative teacher, or oftentimes the most challenging, when you have parents and families that are walking all across the political spectrum. And so I think there's just a real fear of, again, given this charged heightened moment, that you'll be exploring things in class with students that will get back to either the family or the community, and you'll get a lot of blowback from that. So I think that's one sort of source of the fear. The second, which I think is really, to be 100% honest, sort of a tragic moment in our education landscape, is that there are just state and local policies that are forbidding the teaching of certain content that could be related to the election, right? Mm-hmm. So I think we have now at least 18 states that have bans against what we call divisive content. And I think that much of the either issues or rhetoric currently centered in the presidential election might touch on such content, right? And so there's actual real fear for your job, which is very different than sort of blowback because of these policies. In fact, Texas has gone as far as to ban any kind of interaction with elected officials. So, I remember as a ninth grade civics teacher, I did the classical, this was Bush 2 when I was teaching, and talked to them about what we're seeing about the policies and what we think about, and we're trying to advocate. And that got kids excited. We got a letter back from the president. And those types of interactions are now banned in at least one state, or that general sort of interaction with election officials. So I think the policies create another fear. Then the third, I think, is a little bit more mundane, but really kind of impact. It's just coverage, right? In terms of teachers feeling like, oh, I have certain content, whether it's tested content, standards content, what principals want to see, what the school initiative is. And so the idea of kind of slowing down for something that's kind of not in the curriculum, I think, is another sort of mild fear that has resulted in teachers not engaging the election.
What are we losing by just avoiding this topic in the classroom?
A lot. It's a really profound missed opportunity when we're not engaging with the elections. Let me kind of lift this up in a few different ways. Right now, according to a recent Gallup poll, 28% of Americans are satisfied with democracy. That's down more than half of what it was in the early 1990s, right, where it was 60%. So we're kind of at a crisis right now in terms of Americans' belief in our fundamental democratic system, not for this candidate or that candidate, but like, does the system work? Should I be engaged? Will the system work to support its community members? I think that's a tragic number. And so I think schools are the place where we can get folks not only engaged in the process, but also connected to the process, believing in the process. And so when we're not talking about elections, we're missing an opportunity under the expertise of teachers and in sort of the nurturing learning environment of a classroom to really bring students and young people into that. Another, I think, really concrete data point comes out for some research where they circle out of Tufts University looked at what happens when teachers teach students about voting and teach students about actually how to register to vote. And those students were twice as likely to believe that voting and participating in democracy is going to work, right? And so it's really sort of evidence that what we do with our young people really will translate into what young voters do as they get involved formally in the political system. So I think that's one missed opportunity. I think it's also a missed opportunity for the actual work of schools, right? Like it's an opportunity to have real discussions. This is what we're trying to do in our social studies classes, in our English language arts classes, in our civics classes, is to have real discussions about real issues where different perspectives that really matter and connect to both values and policies and content. When you talk about authentic work, which we often say should be the driver of education, it doesn't get more authentic than this. And so to miss out on that opportunity, I think is really unfortunate. You know, if you're going to have these discussions that are like charged and polarized and difficult, what better place to have them than in a school setting with an educator, with some skill sets, with some training to help facilitate those conversations? You know, a colleague maybe 4 or 5 years ago really impressed upon me, like we can't avoid these hard conversations because they're going to happen anyway, right? It's just a swipe away on a phone or click on the dial. And so students are going to be exposed to these sort of rhetoric, charged topics, really disparaging comments, different points of view. So why don't we use our schools as a place where we can really have real meaningful, deep conversation around differences, around important issues? And in some respects, what I really believe is that schools, young people, and teachers can actually be a model for some of the grown-ups in Congress who don't seem to be able to talk to each other, right? So if we really want to see the full possibility of schools as, I would say, the exemplary democratic institution, we need to have these hard conversations about real issues that, you know, the election is focused squarely on.
You mentioned a lot of states, I think you said 18, where there's policies in place that make this incredibly difficult to do. And so I'm wondering, can you talk about an election like this at all in a place where some of these policies might be in place?
Yes, absolutely, you can. I think there's at least two ways to think about it. One is that you might have state policy or district policy, but then you have schools or districts that can be buffers to that policy. I know of several districts within states that have restrictive policies where the district has done some thinking and school leadership has done some thinking around like, how can we responsibly respect the law but still engage in these topics? And so teachers are really supported in that because their institutions are kind of acting as buffers of those policies. With that being said, you know, there's real decision that teachers have to make. I've been on calls, you know, with a bunch of educators and folks expressing real fears and other teachers being like, you know, we need to just stand on our principles and teach regardless. And, you know, one of the things I was thinking about is that one of the educators that was expressing fear was also talking about a mortgage and their children. And like, I can't lose my job, which could be different than, say, maybe a younger teacher that's a little bit more fluid in what they're doing with their lives. And so as you're thinking about, can I teach this? There's a couple of sort of advice that I give. One is to really kind of lean into skills as opposed to the issues. So while there are bans of certain content, almost no state is banning critical thinking, right? No state is banning data analysis. Many states are supporting media analysis, argumentation. So you can really lean into, I think, skills as sort of what you're doing. And when you're writing letters home to parents or you're talking to your administrators or you're thinking about how you're going to justify what you're doing, you're saying, you know, I'm teaching students really important skills. I think that that can be one important sort of shield for that. I think the second thing to think about is closely related to skills is also try to connect it to larger course themes. And this gets at not only the folks that are in state with restrictive policies, but teachers that believe they just can't do it because it's not connected to what they're teaching, right? If you're an English language arts teacher and you're really looking at literature and you're looking at conflict, don't the elections give us a great way to look into that theme of conflict? If you're a science teacher and you're looking at sort of ecosystems and the way different factors are dependent on each other, doesn't looking at sort of political policy give us the opportunity to look at that? So I think trying to connect it to sort of larger, broader, respected goals in your course can give you a little bit of coverage. The other thing is how you do it. So I think that there are ways that you can talk about the election in ways that are kind of factual. Here are the issues. I think you can talk about the election in terms of being really specific around what your goals are and what your takeaways are, understanding the processes, understanding how campaigns work, where it allows you to get to some of the real core, I think, juicy stuff that's going to engage kids. Like, let me understand this political ad. But the objective is, I think, is more kind of broadly stated around the idea of just understanding how the process works. And there's a couple of ways you can give yourself, I think, some shield, particularly when you're working with policies that might be a little bit more restrictive around what you can do with the election and divisive issues.
It sounds like you see this as work that goes beyond just the social studies curriculum and classroom, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of room to deeply integrate it into the social studies, significantly more than we're doing it right now. So our ancient civs teachers are doing it. So you're doing it in U.S. history, not just in your Constitution unit, that it could be a lot more central to the work that we do in the social studies. But I think, many folks argue, one of the foundational purposes of education is to create an educated citizenry, right? It takes a village. It takes a village of educators to sort of build up that citizenry. And so I think there's a lot of different angles that you can come in from it from different subjects. But I do think, for example, if you're looking at climate change, one of, I think, the top issues that, certainly was mentioned in our recent presidential debate, like, let's get our science colleagues to really weigh in on that, bring some of that content to really kind of understand the policies. When you talk about trying to understand, election night and all those graphs and chart, let's leverage our math teachers to do that. When you're talking about the rhetoric that is really, I think, important to unpack and explore and critique and analyze, let's bring our ELA colleagues. It really speaks to all the subjects in ways that I think both respect sort of the disciplinary boundaries that we have, while at the same time to say that if we want a citizenry that's really going to be able to have a full informed capacity, all teachers can chip in to support that work.
Is there areas you shouldn't go?
For teaching the election?
Yeah.
Yes. I would say here are the three common errors or pitfalls that I would recommend folks avoid. The first would be to lead off with an overemphasis on the mechanics, the process. It is important to do high level stuff around the electoral college and whatnot. But when we go too hard on the content, kids are just disengaged, and It's a great way to disengage students. So there's a tendency to do that, and I strongly discourage that. The second, I think, would be, and this could be really dangerous, it's just a superficial glossing over of the candidates or the issues. If you're going to get into the issues and the candidates, I think you need to allow some space to do that deeply, to see multiple perspectives, to really allow kids to take some stance on that. And so to really go deeper and avoid a superficial treatment of both the candidates and the issues would be number two. Number three would be, I think, overly sharing your bias and opinions without a thoughtful, based in educative value, reason and rationale for doing so. So I think we've moved beyond this idea that a teacher can remain purely objective. I think that's impossible. There's always some sort of implicit reveal of our biases. But when you are sharing, or to the extent that you're sharing, any perspective you have related to the election, you're doing so with a specific intent, this is how I can use the sharing of my view to have an educative impact on my students.
Can you just give an example of what you mean by that? If you have a certain stance on an issue that you feel really strongly about as an educator, it's okay to state that as long as there's some reasoning and rationale behind it?
That would be one example. I see why others disagree. I think another example is to be really specific. So I would personally advise educators, not to share the candidate you're voting for, but you can certainly share specific things about the candidate, right? So I might look at the recent presidential debate and say that the rhetoric around migrants that was used by former President Donald Trump was rhetoric that I thought was not supported by facts. And I also thought it was potentially harming and dehumanizing for these specific reasons, right?
Right.
You're making sweeping generalizations. You are using sort of undocumented, sensationalized stories. And what I'm doing there is I'm not only just talking about my particular stance on the rhetoric, but I'm giving students sort of more general tools and frameworks to analyze rhetoric. And I'm also saying that this is my position, right? It's not necessarily the only position. So I think rather than just saying candidate A is terrible or candidate B is awful, and I could say things about both candidates, it's specific and it's backed up on some sort of transferable analytical skills that can help students not only understand this election, but really other elections and, political discourse. And so I think that part is really, really key when you do reveal perspective, is to make sure that there's a sort of educational value to it.
Mhm. And something else that you mentioned that I think is important to note is this is not something that can be one and done. It sounds like you can't just go in there and talk about the election process and check the box and move on, because students want more than that.
Absolutely. Now, it's not always that's what I think, but right, sometimes teachers are faced with, a reality where they might need to do more than, that's what they might be faced with, right? And
Right.
so the less time you have, you need to be really intentional with that and just be careful of not opening up something that you can't really kind of hold. I might go back to the example of the science teacher, like thinking about the election. If you don't have a lot of time because you're trying to get through so many standards and what it is, maybe you limit it to like, hey, let's take advantage and leverage this and focus on like one issue that's central to the election that also connects to our content. And let's go into that for a day or two. Another example, and it gets at processing the election. Like the day after the election, I'm not sure what to think, right? Like I definitely have cleared my schedule and I'm like, I need to be able to process what's happening, work with the educators that I'm teaching in the evening, because it might be a real chaotic, potentially violent, contested situation. And so you might not be teaching about the election, but kids might show up and the world is, really going through it. It's inauguration day or something like that. And you're going to need to respond to those kind of emotions. How do you kind of process it post-election, particularly after 2020?
Right.
But generally speaking, particularly for social studies teachers, but really all teachers, like you got to give it some space. It's such a rich, important topic that really does deserve some space in the curriculum.
And that's not something I'd even given any thought to, the fact that, a lot of times the results of these elections come very late and then you're on tap immediately the next day, 7 a.m. You're in your classroom and you have 20 something students sitting in front of you who may want to talk about it or might have feelings or views or things that they want to share. And that has to be so challenging as an educator to kind of process yourself what's going on. You're there to work with kids who have a lot of thoughts on these things as well.
Absolutely. That's why we should give a huge shout out to all of our educators out there that are doing this work, working with our young people in this moment in time, because students are bringing a lot to the classroom based on what they're seeing and hearing that's going on in politics in the world.
Tell me a little bit about your civics thinking project and the idea of developing habits of mind.
So the Civics Thinking Project is an endeavor that my colleague Jack Snyder and I launched a couple of years ago with the idea that oftentimes what we teach in school is concretely informed by the way experts do something, right? So if you look at a lot of history curriculum, we teach students how do you read primary sources, where you look at the context, where you look at sort of the author's bias, where you look at the close reading of words and implicit meaning. A lot of that was codified in some research where historians shared their thought processes while reading primary sources, and educational researchers kind of documented it, said, oh, this is what you're doing. This is the move that you're making. This is the habit of mind that you're deploying when you're reading this document. So can we build some curriculum around that? Under the work of Sam Weinberg and many others at Stanford, they were able to develop a robust history curriculum. So Jack and I, who were also at Stanford a number of years ago working with Sam Weinberg, said, why don't we do the same thing with civics, right? Like there is so much work that is being done in civics. Can we document how people do this work and then take those moves and habits of mind and translate it into like concrete, explicit lessons, units, and curriculum for young people to engage in? We're really trying to do both research, curriculum development, and professional development to really bring civic expertise into concrete tasks and skills that students can do in the classroom.
Will this election be a part of that?
As a matter of fact, we did some work with teachers just 2 weeks ago where we were approached by the district. They were like, could you help our teachers think through how to teach the election? And then we said, we think we can. We think that there is some real expertise in the minds of your teachers. And so let's bring that out. And so what we did, about 50 teachers, all social studies teachers, we pulled some ballot initiatives from a couple of years ago and had them do think aloud, articulate the mental moves that you're doing. And they did these in small groups and they identified a bunch of moves. And then we said, choose a couple, one, maybe two, that you think are really important. And think about a lesson that you might develop or a series of lessons to teach these skills. this is work that's going to happen in the next few weeks, right? They were like, wow, like I was really kind of thinking a lot about like context when I was doing this. Or I really was sort of going to multiple sources to kind of like, fact check and give me some additional information. Or I was really thinking about impact and unintended consequences. So these are all things that we could be thinking about when we're looking at issues in this current election. It's going to be great. We're actually going to go back in a month or two, kind of see what they developed and how they've engaged young people.
Any final tips that you have for educators listening as we round out these final weeks before the election?
In terms of where you might want to start, if you're thinking about like, how can I begin to engage my students in the election? I think one place to really start is start with students' interests and questions, right? Because they're authentic, they're hooks, and they're often really, really good. So before even thinking about what am I going to plan, really kind of either pay attention to or ask students, what are you interested in about the election? So that's one recommendation. The Democratic Knowledge Project has a free sort of module about the election. And they start off with the idea of what makes a good leader. And I just thought that was a really good general question that students can really bring some insight. It creates a really critical lens to analyze the election. So I think that's another great place to start. Choosing one or two issues for in-depth exploration. So it's not just about the candidates, but it's about the issue itself. Give some students some expertise and they'll try to match it up to how candidates are sort of thinking about that. And the last, and this is an enduring skill, and students, particularly those in purple states, but throughout the nation, media analysis, right? Because we're going to be inundated with messaging around this. And so how do we go beyond just the sort of surface level message we're hearing and really sort of critically analyze that? So I think those are 4 great places to start. Student interest, what makes a good leader, choosing one or two issues to go deep into, and media analysis. So that would be sort of one set of recommendations. A second set is like things to have in place, right? And so this should be like stuff that you do at the start of the year and you really cultivate throughout the year. The first is really working with students to sort of unpack like, what are your values? What's your vision of a just world, right? So before we have any conversation about this candidate, that candidate, this issue or that issue, like what's our broader and deeper sense of a good world? And that can become a really powerful critical lens to not only analyze issues, but also to talk across difference. Which leads me to the second thing that I think you want to be doing to really sort of support students to talk about the election is really kind of set up a culture and the skills for discourse in your classroom, right? So it's not just about teacher talking, students listening, or students having surface level conversations, but how do we have real deep conversations about both abstract principles, things in our backyard, and yes, national issues and the election. And then last but not least, and this is some work that I do and I could go at length, is really how do you think about helping young people process emotions and respond to charged comments, right? Because that's not going to come up in every conversation about the election, but oftentimes that's one of the key things that inhibits teachers from doing is that the fear of emotions are going to come up or a charged comment's going to come up and they're not sure how to deal with that. It's going to make for a little uneasiness. That's part of like the work. That's part of the political discourse. So really kind of doing that throughout the year can be powerful. And then finally, I just want to again send just a word of gratitude for teachers that are teaching in this particular moment. I just think it's unbelievably challenging, hard, and so important. So for those folks that are like, doing this on a daily basis, I don't want my sort of, oh, this is what you should do to sort of suggest in any way that folks aren't trying, folks aren't doing. I think we have examples of wisdom and thoughtfulness in the way educators are engaging young people with the election throughout the nation. I think it's really important to lift those up and acknowledge those as well.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you.
Eric Soto-Shed is a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He co-leads the Civics Thinking Project, a research initiative focused on creating innovative, research-based civic assessments and curriculum. I'm Jill Anderson. This is the Harvard EdCast, produced by the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Thanks for listening.